Yeah. Okay. I'm John Rible. I have been involved using Forth since 1976. A couple of months ago, I got a phone call that got me back interested. I haven't been using computer stuff for about 10 years. My brain slowed down. I just not doing it so much. And then Green Arrays had a big, well, Intellisys had a big falling out, and I basically retired. But a couple of months ago, I got a phone call asking if I was the John Rible that lived in Cambridge in Massachusetts in 1976 and had a Sphere microcomputer. Whoa, I did. That was my first microcomputer. I had been just quit a job after 5 years and getting tired of dealing with the Massachusetts political scene as a community college data processing center director. And all of the microcomputers coming out, I could have one at home. And I kept looking. Massachusetts is so far away from Silicon Valley and all of the club stuff and even the fourth interest group starting up. So I responded to this guy and he pulled me in for an interview. Turns out he was writing a book and putting things together to get the history of this Sphere, because the company was only around for 2 years and only a few thousand of these machines sold. The Sphere was arguably the first tabletop microcomputer, desktop computer. One built-in unit. Actually, above me, www.sphere.computers. That website has an emulation of the Sphere machine that he put up and got me interested in looking at that again. And I went and I found I had saved a whole bunch of the paper. I had donated all of my hardware to the Computer History Museum. And he's been working with them. He's actually been reconstructing the cassette tapes.
It's that computer, not computers.
It's what?
It's that computer, not computers.
Computer.
Computer. I just
you took the S out. Okay, thank you.
Get your S out.
And that was a strange time. I mean, I spent $1,200 in January of 1976 for a machine that had 4K of RAM and 5 256-byte EPROMs. And a screen, the computer screen was actually a television that they had welded, taken it apart and put in this package. 32 by 32. 32 characters per line, 32 lines. And it was a bear to use. If you play around with that emulation, you'll find how much of a hassle it was. And I had just learned about Forth and started and wrote to FIG and got some information and started getting the fourth dimensions or whatever the thing was at the time. I had written a version of Tom Pittman's Tiny Basic that I called Extendable Tiny Basic in 74 or 75 that was basically a token threaded engine that you could add opcodes to Tiny Basic. I had known nothing about Forth at the time, and when I learned about Forth, I realized, all this stuff sort of ties together. And so I started working on it and found that I really wasn't sure what I was doing, but I created an assembler. First, I started to work on an assembler, fourth-based assembler for 6800, and I found that there were so many opcodes that I didn't want them to be where the execution took place. The opcodes became literals. And the address modes, of which there were only four, maybe five or six, four basic address modes, those had all the smarts in them. They knew enough to add a bit to the opcode if they needed it, and to whether it was an 8-bit or a 16-bit parameter to go get assembled. And then thinking about the code, it was so new, I had no idea what the threaded code kinds of stuff was going to be. So I used subroutine threaded code. And I did not have the square brackets. The square brackets for the sphere were indications of the blocks that were going to go out on the cassette. So they were unavailable to me. And I used the caret to toggle between assembly code and fourth code. Fourth code just meant that the word was compiled as a subroutine call, but I only had to put the word down. I didn't have to write the assembly code. I could just write all these words that were defined. Every fourth word was a subroutine. I couldn't call it fourth at the time. Fourth Inc. was rather possessive of the word fourth. So this became SLURP, a structured language using reverse Polish. I call it my tongue-in-cheek acronym. It seemed to work, much like Chuck's CM fourth later with the Novix. It was a ping pong. I would have a system that sort of worked, make changes, and then I would compile it to a different place in memory. I couldn't save that because all the addresses are hard-coded. So I would run it a little bit and maybe make a couple more changes and then compile it back in the original location and write it out on a Kansas City cassette 2 or 3 times, very slowly, little bits at a time, reading it back in. It took forever to get anything. How did I get started doing fourth? Mel Norell, who was the organizer or owner of a company called Programma, tried to he just sold, he got programmers to work for him, and then he would sell the software. And he sent me a 6502 thesis that was the source code for a fourth system. No idea whose it was. It was just this code, and it was all annotated and crazy angled copies. And so I had to figure out how that worked and to bring it over to the 6800. I was doing this as a hobby. It was not a job. I was having to work other stuff. So it was taking me a long time. And I wasn't doing it fast enough for Programma. So we separated, went our own ways, and they published somebody else's fourth. In the newsletters that were sent out, first by Sphere and then by Programma, about the Sphere, everybody complained about that fourth. And when I wrote to FIG, Dave Bolton replied that they've only gotten responses, bad responses. They had not gotten anything positive about it. Ben, who was the guy that called me, turned me on to a bunch of information websites. On this website, you can find a bunch of links to other places. But he sent me a listing of the fourth that was published. And I read through it, and I was just appalled at how bad that code was written. It was like it was copied from a different machine, and there were multiple levels people they had to go through. It's interesting looking back at that effort 40, 50, 70, 50 years, 45 years later, with the experience I've had in Forth. I've been working in Forth ever since. To see how horrible it was. And it just said, I just told myself, I've got to fix this. So I'm slowly working this weekend or so a month, putting it together again. And then I found in the notes that I had, I was so upset with the 256 byte monitor at the time, or 1K monitor, with an extra 256 bytes to deal with the cassette interface, that I had started working on rewriting the monitor as if it were Forth based. And it's a lot easier to think about creating 1K worth of code than it is, 2 or 3K for the whole Forth system. The monitor is a much smaller system. That's what I'm working on now, and I'm considering myself halfway through. I've got some of it working, and I'll just keep playing with it. That is basically what I have to say. I just wanted to tell people that that old machine is still, I really hadn't gotten into retro computing at all, but it's been fascinating to go back on it through this emulator. Ben has given me his developer's interface to that environment, and it's made it quite possible. I'm using SwiftForth to target compile, and then I just do a memory dump out of the SwiftForth memory and cut and paste it into that environment. Are there any questions briefly that I might be able to answer?
Well, maybe like a comment, because I remember when this was back like 1983, where a lot of Forth through different architectures was being supplied. I remember seeing the one for VAX. And you know what? All it was a PDP 11 code. So it was just directly copied over.
So, John, talking about PDP code being ported over to the VAX.
Well,
for Forth.
Actually, they didn't even bother to do that.
Just moving it.
It just
running it, yeah.
I remember the guy, Mike Keener, he's up here, he worked on FireWire. Actually, he's the guy that started FireWire, but he gave me the thing here, this is a piece of crap. I said, you got any other stuff there with you? He gave me some other stuff, these listings. But they were at 8.5 by 11. I wish I held on to them. So
Ben gave a talk at the Vintage Computer Festival in the end of September, and it's up on the site. You can hear his history of what he's went on with it. I also had a Southwest Tech dot matrix printer, 9 dots, 32 columns. Fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you, John.
Welcome, John.
So, in the great tradition of not keeping to the schedule, we squeezed John in at his request. So, For all of you schedule aficionados, you know, you're in the wrong place. Thank you for your patience.